Today we are very happy to introduce Professor James Valentini, who has served as Dean of Columbia College and Vice President for Undergraduate Education since September 2011. In 2009, Professor Valentini was selected as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and earlier as a Fellow of the American Physical Society for his research involving chemical reaction dynamics. We have spoken about light and design from several points of view, and I think it's very interesting to listen what Professor Valentini is going to teach us about appearance, perception, and impression of light. So thank you very much, Professor Valentini. I leave you the word.
Fabio, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this event as part of Italian Design Week. Light and perception and color has been something of interest to me for a very long time, and I am really grateful for the opportunity to speak as part of this conference and this event. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will be using, and I hope that our audience will find this both informative and entertaining. This is a presentation about the appearance, perception, and impression of light, topics that I have been interested in for a very long time in my life, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to make this presentation as part of Italian Design Week, and specifically with regard to design of and with light. There's a famous quote called "Seeing is believing," at least it appears in English a lot in America, that's meant to convey if you see something, you know something. There's a lack of ambiguity implied in that, a presence of certainty, and an expectation that everyone sees the same thing. This is a quote attributed to Thomas Fuller, a doctor in the 18th century, but that seeing is believing is actually only part of what he said. He said, seeing is believing, but feeling is the truth. And this is really very apt description about human vision, because it does involve feeling and emotion and interpretation. It does involve more than a technical act of processing. So I'm going to show that first by looking at a simple image. This is a collection of tennis balls, which I think almost everyone has seen either actually or a photo of. And we have very little ambiguity about what it is we're seeing. We have very little doubt that we're all seeing the same thing. But some years ago, not so long ago, the Atlantic magazine, an American publication, had an article called "What Color is a Tennis Ball?" written by Marina Curran. And as part of this article, people were surveyed about what they perceived to be the color of these tennis balls. Nearly 30,000 people were surveyed. Of those 30,000 participants, 52% said the tennis balls were green, 42% said the tennis balls were yellow, and 6% said other, implying some other color. Now, when we talk about vision, human vision, we talk about seeing things through our own eyes. And although there are individual eyes that we are seeing things through, we have a sense that we're all seeing things the same way. And at a physiological level, that is true, obviously. There is a set of physiological and biochemical processes that constitute vision, which is illustrated by this diagram in which parts of the process are numbered 1 through 5. I will go through those individually. Process 1, shown in the left part of the illustration. First, light enters the eye and is focused on the retina by the lens. The second step in that is a photoreceptor protein absorbs the light, and the consequence of absorption of the light is that that protein actually changes its shape. That change in shape initiates a process in which neural cells are activated, and the neural cells provide a transmission of a signal shown by number 3 in this diagram and indicated by the dotted black line. That's the beginning of the transmission of that signal. The signal travels throughout the eye to the optic nerve, labeled by number 4 in this diagram. The optic nerve then sends the signal to the brain, number 5, where the image is actually interpreted. And I want to highlight here the steps in that. It involves indeed light. The light is processed, and the processing involves ultimately an interpretation. While this is a physiological process, there is a process of interpretation, which is a fundamentally human process and as much an emotional process as it is a physiological process. Human vision about color in particular is very specific. We have what's called trichromatic vision. It's called trichromatic because there are 3 kinds of entities in the eye that allow us to see color. These are 3 kinds of cone cells. In the diagram at the top, they have some of the cone cells are shown. One of the cone cells is shown in green, one in red, one in blue, to emphasize that there are 3 kinds, though they don't actually appear in color in your eye. They are simply protein molecules, but there are different protein molecules which have different optical absorption shown by the diagram in the lower right corner of this slide. Some are sensitive in the blue, some are sensitive in the green, and some are sensitive in kind of the yellow and red. These are labeled S, M, and L for short wavelength, medium wavelength, and long wavelength. When we see color as human beings, what we see is a process in which different photoreceptors in these cone cells process different wavelengths of light, and then our brain processes that. The visual cortex of our brain, a particular part of our brain, processes the separate signals from these types of cone cells, and in that processing, interprets the color. But we don't see images any longer just through our own eyes, though we do see them through our own eyes. We create images. We create images of actual objects, and then we look at the images rather than looking at the objects themselves frequently by seeing through the eyes of a digital camera or some other digital device. And here we have a photograph of a professional photographer taking a picture of something. And when the photographer takes a picture of something, it is the camera that is processing the light from that object and processing that to create an image that is later reproduced that we see, in which we look at the image, we don't actually look at the object, in which case our eyes are processing something that has already been processed. The steps in a digital camera of processing are related to those in the eye, but technically completely different. The detector of light in the eye is not a set of proteins, obviously. It's actually a charge-coupled device sensor shown here in the middle of this diagram. And the camera actually perceives color by a process using what's called a Bayer filter to filter out the light so that different pixels in this CCD sensor are sensitive to different light. And the Bayer filter contains red, green, and blue filters, which means that certain pixels in this CCD sensor will be sensitive to red, green, and blue light because that's what's been filtered out. That signal then from the CCD sensor goes to an analog to digital converter. Then it goes through a processing called demosaicing. A particular kind of mathematical algorithm is used to process that image, and then a digital record is made of that image. And that's the process by which an image of an object is created that we then later ourselves look at. We look at a lot of images this way, but just as with our eyes, this involves light being processed in a particular way and then being interpreted. It is not our eye that's doing the interpretation. It is a human being creating a set of steps, creating devices, and then a processing of the electronic signals in those devices to interpret what was actually seen. This depends very much on the nature of the CCD sensor, the nature of the filter, the nature of the demosaicing algorithm. And I'm going to show how that can lead to substantially different results, even when images are taken of the very same object. I want to look at something about which there's no doubt about the color. This is an actual automobile. An automobile which has a very specific color. It's called platinum silver metallic. It has a particular manufacturer's code, M7T. There is no doubt about the color of the automobile. Every one of those automobiles comes out exactly the same. There are many of them, and pictures can be taken of them by a digital camera, by various photographers at various times using various cameras. Here, I'm going to show you two pictures. Here's one of the pictures of such a vehicle, and here's another picture of the same vehicle. And you can see that although the lighting in both of these is very similar, this is done under daylight, not on what is really a cloudy day, so it's really indirect lighting. But this is taken by two different photographers using two different cameras. And these two automobiles, which are exactly the same color, do not look exactly the same color in these two photographs because they have been processed in a particular way. The image has been interpreted by the software in a digital camera, and we get two different images. If you ask which of these is the correct one, my answer is neither. I actually own one of these cars, and I don't think, my own perception is, it's not the color of the one in the image in the top, and it's not the color of the image in the bottom. It's actually a different color. And that's because I process my visual image of this object differently than these digital cameras do. And so I have an opinion formed by my own brain's interpretation and processing of a signal that involves an estimation or evaluation or assessment of what the actual object looks like. And this is very clearly demonstrated here because we're looking at two objects which we know to be identical in color, because that's the nature of the manufacturing process, the nature of the painting of the automobile process, but look quite different when photos are taken by different images. There's Psalm 36 has a line, "In thy light shall we see light." This actually happens to be the motto of Columbia University. It actually is a metaphorical part of, in our motto, it's metaphorical, but there is a light that nature has given us that we see. There's a particular kind of light that was created for us. It's called daylight. We're all familiar with daylight. This is a picture of the day sky. And we know that this is what we see when we look at the sky. But we also know that we can take a device called a prism or some other device and let the light pass through it. And we can separate that light into its component parts. Every light source, daylight or any artificial light that we create, has a particular spectrum, and that particular spectrum is very important in exactly how we perceive something. Because when we perceive, as we saw when we looked at the visual process, we are processing the light. We are processing the light comes into our eye. What light comes into our eye depends on what the light source is. Even when the light looks pretty much the same to us, it can actually be different. Each light source has a particular spectrum, that is a distribution of colors. This is the distribution. In the lower right panel is a plot of the distribution of colors and how much of each color is present in sunlight. This is the light that we evolved as human beings to respond to. This is the light that was part of nature and still is the light that is the predominant one in which we look at things, at least when we're outside. But we have many man-made light sources now on which we depend, not only at night, but also during the day in many enclosed sources. We have very many different kinds of light, very many different kinds of devices to produce that light. And each one of them has a characteristic spectrum, just as the sun has a characteristic spectrum of light. And I show here 6 different man-made light sources, but more correctly, the spectrum from 6 different man-made sources of light: a xenon lamp, an incandescent lamp, the familiar historical lamp, a fluorescent lamp, halogen lamp, 2 different kinds of light-emitting diode lamps, so-called cool white and warm white. Each has its own characteristic spectrum. That spectrum is very important. When we look at the light from each of these devices, we don't see the spectrum. We don't recognize the spectrum consciously. Our eye is not acting like a prism to separate this, but this various wavelengths of light are actually entering our eye and being processed by our brain, even though that's not a conscious process that we're aware of. When we look at an object, a light's shown in the diagram at the bottom of this slide, a light source illuminates an object. Light reflected from that object is what enters our eye, and what we see is the spectrum of the reflected light. The spectrum, the distribution of colors in the reflected light, depends on the spectrum, that is the distribution of colors of light in the light source. So for each different light source, a different spectrum or distribution of colors of light will be reflected from this object and will enter our eye. And while we may see the object very similarly, we will not see the object identically, because what we see depends on the spectrum of the light that is imposed on the object and the light that's reflected from the object that enters our eye. Many light sources are present in our environment, and we can see how that affects what we actually see. This is a picture actually taken at night. This is Sydney Harbor in Australia. You can see a lot of different sources of light. The green light that you see on the bridge is created by mercury lamps. You'll see a lot of yellowish light in the a cityscape in the lower panel of this image. Has a kind of yellow character, but you also see light emanating from windows that is much whiter. And then you see the lightning itself, which is a light source, which has a kind of white-purple glow. Every one of the sources of light in our environment, whether natural or whether artificial, has a specific spectral distribution that determines what we're actually going to see and how we interpret things. So some lights are good and some lights are poor. That is the lights we create. There are many different lights we kind of created. I've already shown the spectral distribution of some of them, but we describe some of these as good and some are poor. That assessment is based on how the light in illuminating an object is processed by our eye, and whether that processing looks like what we are naturally accustomed to, which is the illumination of the object by sunlight. These man-made sources of light, several of which are shown here, an incandescent and a halogen lights, provide what is usually referred to as quite excellent lighting. And then there are various kinds. There are particular kinds of fluorescent lights, metal halide lights, simple fluorescent lights, a particular kind of mercury light, sodium light, clear mercury light, and so-called low-pressure sodium lights. These are all commercially used in various purposes, for various purposes in different settings. The kind of light that each produces can be graded sensibly by us, from excellent to very poor. I'm going to show how we actually characterize that. One way is just really qualitatively in something we're all, I think, familiar with. When we look at the lighting, outside lighting of streets or parking lots or buildings, we can find different kinds of lighting. The newest, the most recent use light-emitting diodes to illuminate a street. And here on the left is an image of a street emitted by light-emitting diodes. The light from the diodes looks very white to us. It does have a characteristic spectrum, nonetheless, even if it looks white to us. It's very common to have mercury lights illuminating things. The bridge in that Sydney Harbor picture looked green because of green mercury lights, and that's what's shown in this middle panel. And then finally, very commonly, we'll find streets illuminated by low pressure sodium lights, which have this very yellowish glow, which most people consider, at least many people consider, terrible lighting. And I think they consider terrible lighting, that's an emotional response, but part of that emotional response is if you look at objects under sodium lighting, they look nothing at all like they look like in daylight. And there's a kind of eerie character to that, to the way objects look in under these sodium lights. One of the reasons, however, that these low pressure sodium lights are used is because they're very energy efficient. And the primary concern that people have had in lighting the streets with these low pressure sodium lights is to use as little energy as possible to provide the lighting that simply provides a safe environment. That is, that we can detect the presence of an object, not that we find it aesthetically pleasing. Right? But how do we judge? There is a quantitative way we actually judge light. It's called a color rendering index. And a color rendering index is a quantitative measure of how faithful a particular light source, when illuminating an object, produces an image that our eyes process as looking very much like that we would see in daylight. There are two images here. One on the left is using a light source that has a high color rendering index, and the one on the right has a low color rendering index. And I will illustrate the difference by highlighting the what I'd call the blue colored pencil in the left side of each of the images, and call your attention to the difference. The one on the left looks really blue. The one on the right has this kind of gray-blue washed out character. That's the nature of low color rendering index lights. They tend to wash out the color. The colors don't look vibrant. The colors don't look alive. The colors don't look so pleasing to most people's eyes. That color rendering index is a measure that we use to describe lights as to how faithful they are at illuminating an object and producing an image that looks to us like the one we would see in daylight, when we see the colors as vibrant, when the natural environment that we have involved in has produced a means of us seeing and a way of us processing the image that we consider the true image, the faithful image. And different kinds of man-made light sources are better or worse at reproducing that kind of image. And the color rendering index, highlighted here by this blue ellipse that I have circled around a line that is underneath the different lamps, ranges from 100 for incandescent halogen lights, all the way down to 5 for those low pressure sodium lights, the kind we saw in that streetscape just a little earlier. This color rendering index is a quantitative measure, but again, human perception involves emotion, involves assessment, involves interpretation, involves personal evaluation. But here are 3 images, a same object, same human being, images taken using daylight, fluorescent light, and incandescent light. Each of these images looks different to us because the light source illuminating this young woman is different. The spectrum of each of those light sources is shown in the panel beneath each of the images, and you will see something different because the light illuminating the object is different, which emphasizes that what we see depends on the light source that's illuminating the object. In this case, a lovely young woman. Now, whether one prefers the daylight image on the left or the incandescent light image on the right, some people might actually prefer the incandescent light image on the left, is obviously a measure of human judgment. There are many different humans which will make judgments, as there are in all aspects of life. In these judgments, authority figures play a role, and this is always the case about judging. We have authority figures who do judging. We have some authority figures who have great authority. This is Helena Rubinstein, a designer who has famous saying. She says, "Daylight reveals color, artificial light drains it." This is an assessment on her part, and this is a judgment and evaluation. It comes from an authority. And she is an authority who much prefers the image on the left, the one that is illuminated by daylight, to either of the others, either the one in fluorescent light or the one in incandescent light. Now, interestingly, you're seeing an image of me right now in this presentation that is not illuminated by daylight. It's actually illuminated by a series of lights. There are 4 different lights that are illuminating my face and many lights that are illuminating the room behind me to create a particular kind of image that is processed by the camera in my computer and then delivered to each of you as an electronic signal and then processed by your computer. That lighting that I have created has deliberately been adjusted to produce an image that I like. I'm not being illuminated by daylight, but I am being illuminated by a series of lights. They actually happen to be different kinds of light emitting diode lights, which have different spectral distributions to create an image of myself that I would like to convey to you. I have made an assessment. I have made a judgment. I'm not an authority figure in a general sense, but I am an authority about my own appearance. And I am a person who would like you to see me in a particular way when processed by the camera that I'm looking at, that creates a digital signal that's then sent to each of you. I'm actually not sure what each of you sees because I don't know how each of your computers processes that digital signal that is received and how your monitor then recreates an image through that digital processing. But I have tried to create one that at least what I'm looking at on my screen is a favorable image of me. So I'm making a judgment. I'm making an assessment. That's a very personal one. I'm not an authority figure, but I am one who has a very deep interest in a particular image that is my own image in these Zoom broadcasts. So I want to look at other authority figures and look at the question of authority and ambiguity and perception and individuality. I'm going to look at some images from an American TV show called Project Runway. It's a show in which amateur designers have an opportunity to respond to challenges issued by experts, expert designers, or experts of other kinds. Then the experts judge the response of the amateurs to those challenges, to those assignments, and then judge the participants. All right. This is, I'm going to show you some pictures, photos from a particular episode of Project Runway, this American show. It's from season 5, episode 4. It's an episode called Rings of Glory. It was broadcast August 6th of 2008. This particular broadcast struck me as soon as I saw it. The project, the assignment in this was that the contestants on this show, the amateur designers, were each charged with designing a uniform for the United States Olympic team. That uniform was expected to have the colors of the American flag, that is red, white, and blue. And each designer obviously was making an effort to produce an article of clothing, a uniform that conveyed that. One of those contestants is a young man named Daniel Feld. And his creation is shown in this screenshot, modeled by the young woman to his right, a dress for members of the United States Olympic team. And when it came time for his creation to be judged, one of the judges, her name is Nina Garcia, she's the editor of an American fashion magazine called Elle, said to Mr. Feld about his creation, "There is no way that is blue," referring to the color, the primary color of the dress that this model is wearing. Now, Nina Garcia has authority because she has a position of considerable regard and recognition as the editor of an American fashion magazine. And of course, she was explicitly chosen as an authority by being chosen as a judge for this TV program. Now, I think when I look at the particular image in front of me, I would agree with Nina Garcia that that doesn't look like blue to me. But I want to show you how I'm not sure what Nina Garcia saw, actually, because I wasn't in the room with Nina Garcia. I wasn't actually looking at the model illuminated by whatever the light source was in the room. Daniel Feld, the contestant, and Nina Garcia were all in a studio, illuminated by a particular light source, an artificial light source, a man-made light source, not natural daylight. I don't know what they saw. What I'm processing is an electronic image that appeared on a screen during the broadcast of this particular episode of this television show. I want to show you some of the ambiguity that arises. This is that same image. In the lower right is the image I had shown you, which is the one that I believed I saw when this show was broadcast. But since there's a video recording of this broadcast and you can access it after the TV broadcast, I have also looked at this broadcast on other devices, like a computer. And on one of the devices I looked at, I did not see the image of Daniel Feld, the contestant, and his model that's shown in the lower right. What I actually saw was the image of Daniel Feld, the contestant, and his model shown in the upper right of my screen. And on my screen right now, that definitively looks to me like blue. So even among authorities are limited by the light that they can see. I don't know what Nina Garcia, the judge, saw because I wasn't there. The processing that light, the processing that image that's delivered to me and delivered to my home at two different times in two different ways produced two different images, one of which would lead me to agree with her that no, the model is not wearing something that's blue, and the other which would lead me, the one in the upper right, to contest what Nina Garcia said, because it looks decidedly like blue to me. But I have really no idea what this looks like to any of you, because an image on my computer screen is being recorded. It's also part of my PowerPoint presentation. It will be digitally transmitted to you, and then it will appear on the screen of some device you have. And in that processing, there's many steps of processing that can lead to a lack of fidelity in replicating what was actually originally seen. This is one of the challenges of human life. Our perception, our human perception, now that we have so much that we perceive, is not actually of an object illuminated by daylight in which two of us are standing next to one another and looking at the same object at the same time, but involves looking at images that are presented to us on a screen. How we perceive, how we process, and how we interpret, while individual, is further made ambiguous by the processing of these images, these electronic images that are transmitted to different devices and processed by different devices, different software, so that we're not really sure what each of us is looking at. And this is one of the aspects of the world of Zoom that we have been in for quite a few months now, that I've been quite interested in. When we have a Zoom classroom, which we've done at Columbia many times, I'm looking at many images of people, and sometimes we do screen sharing, and sometimes we look at images, and I'm never really sure that what I'm looking at and what someone else is looking at is actually the same thing. A great deal of ambiguity has been introduced into our lives by the specific processing, not due to different kinds of light sources, but rather due to electronic processing of digital signals that actually are so much a part of our world of perception, our world of communication with one another, and our world of sharing images and discussing them. I'm going to stop with that, and I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. It's been a pleasure to make this, and a pleasure to be part of this a great event. Thank you all very much for the opportunity.
James, thank you so much, because your presentation was so interesting that I have some questions. I am sorry.
Certainly.
First of all, it's so beautiful to hear what you say about the fact that we are looking at images inside of us much more than objects, because that's exactly what Jacopo da Lentini, an ancient Italian poet, was saying in 13th century about the fact that the painter depict before painting his painting inside his art what he's going then to paint outside. So it's he's creating an image inside him.
Yes.
So this is so incredibly linked to our literary history. And then I have some question, because it's very interesting the fact that light is connected to emotions and interpretation. My first question is, the first thing a contemporary designer told me when he entered the Cultural Institute was, do you have dimmers? You have too strong, a light which is too strong. You must use dimmers. So sometimes new designer love a sort of soft light, which is not is not exactly the daylight.
Correct.
Why?
A matter of preference. Right. which raises
emotion.
Exactly. So people want to create a certain feeling, a certain sensibility, and the fact that we have different kinds of light, different light sources, gives designers obviously a great deal of latitude in creating a certain feeling by the way that an object, or more specifically a room, is actually illuminated. So daylight is not necessarily the reference point that we all view as actually the preferred one, in contrast to what Helena Rubinstein said. Everyone who's a designer has their own aesthetic sensibility and their own sensibility that they want to create when they're designing. And this is part of the perception. It is part of using light to create a feeling. So seeing is indeed believing, indeed, but feeling is the truth, as I started with. And that's what designers are really aiming for, as I understand it. Yes.
Yes, not just to create a space, but to create emotions inside the people. And then it's interesting also the fact that we have many people who prefer the movies in black and white, or the photograph. Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yes. Yes. Who feel that the color is somehow distracting in some way, and that when done in black and white, they're focused more on what is being said, the interaction of people. This is true. Again, this involves human assessment, human judgment, human feeling, which is really key to this. It is human perception that is present here, even though the process of lighting things and the process by which light is processed and the image process is a physiological process in our eye with cameras and computers as such. It's a physical process involving various kinds of detectors and various kinds of light emitting diodes or liquid crystal display or other devices that can record light, respond to light, or actually reproduce light. But fundamentally, this is a human process, and it is how we feel about things that really matters, which is why when we entered the Zoom world, at least I entered the Zoom world in mid-March of last year, I put some considerable effort into creating in the den of my house, which is where I'm doing this Zoom presentation from, to have a particular sensibility, a particular lighting, which is done by a collection of lights that's illuminating the room. but more specifically, a collection of lights that's illuminating my face, that I wanted to look a certain way. And that was my aesthetic judgment. And again, my judgment about how I wanted to appear. But nonetheless, I don't know how I appear to anyone else, because I don't know how that image is processed and delivered. It's delivered to many, many different devices and then processed and displayed. And almost certainly what I see of my image now is not what anyone else sees.
You are so right, I think, and thank you very much, because everything manhood touches becomes a language. Food,
Yes.
light, everything. So light too is a language for us, not just a physical fact. And every language has a meaning that comes from the people who is sending the message, but has a meaning which depends also on the people who is receiving the message, because there are two different interpretations, which is the hermeneutical circle in literary terms, and you were able to let us understand that this circle exists also in the realm of the light. From now on, we are going to look also to a landscape in the night with different eyes, trying to find the different lights and the different languages that everyone who is collaborating to a landscape wanted to send, because they will be the person who turned on the light in a house, in a city, in a street. So we have different messages in the night. So, James, thank you so much. It was enlightening. Sorry for the...
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I hope that we can collaborate again about poetry, because at this point it's interesting also to see how aware poets were in 12th or 13th century about this issue of perception of light and shades.
Yes. Your comparison of this to language is, in my view, really apt. One of the things I have used sometimes to illustrate how the processing of an image as it moves around and is delivered to different people can actually change. I've taken a line from the Divine Comedy. I started with a particular English translation of Inferno. There's a canto 3 in Inferno, which in the most commonly in English, it said, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." I started with that, and I processed that. There are many translations of that from the original Italian, but that one is the most common in English. I processed that through Google Translate. I processed that through a whole bunch of languages, back to it, and first step to Italian, and then through many, many, many languages, and then finally back to English. And it's not the same message at all. And so this idea of translation and translation and the processing of images is very similar. What you lose along the way, because you don't hear the same thing, you don't see the same thing, because there's a great deal of processing that goes on that we're not consciously aware of, at least with images. We're more consciously aware of it with translation, but we're not consciously aware of it with regard to visual perception. And again, I have no idea what you and I are communicating here. I have no idea what my image looks like to you. I know what it looks like to me. I have no idea what you're seeing.
It's a good day.
Anyway, Fabio, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.